dope fiend, a thug, alcoholic, addict, federal prisoner, and a state prisoner in the state of Georgia. That's just parts of my life, things that ultimately led to pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. When I lived the thug life, I did many things that, back then, because I was doing so many drugs and alcohol, I didn't really have to feel, I disassociated myself from what I was doing, and I justified what I did inside my sick mind. Inside my head, I was kind of like a modern-day Robin Hood, where I stole from the rich and gave to the poor, namely myself. But I did share with others, but that didn't justify what I did. And the things I told myself inside my head to justify those behaviors, that didn't make it right. Why did I do those things? I really don't know. I could blame it on a lot of different factors, but the reality is I made a lot of bad choices. I was a very devious child, had a lot of issues, and, I don't blame it on my mom, but, because I was so unruly, she got to the point where sometimes she'd beat me until I stopped crying, and, that just helped me to turn off the emotions. So, I just click that switch, and it was Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And because this right here is really about recovery, I'm sharing my stories just to show that, I was screwed up. I was a real screwed up person, but I changed my life, and I say that just to let you know that if you're going down the same road, if you want to change, you really can. For the 25 plus years I drank and used, once I knew I had a problem, then a lot of time I would try to quit, and I'd say I was going to quit. Then I would end up, I'd get weak, and then I would decide to do it, and then I would tell myself a lie. Well, I just changed my mind. After I started getting locked up, then many times I would tell myself, I wasn't going to get out and do anything again, and I was tired of being locked up. But what would I do? I would get out, and it always resulted in the same thing, where I decided to smoke a joint or have a little drink, or I would do some type of mind-altering substance. And that ultimately led to me doing the same thing again, because I would get where I was doing more than I could afford to pay for by working. So I would go to robbing and stealing. And I had some serious psychological issues, and that's something that's actually real common with people with addiction problems. In one study, I think it's 2002, they determined that 30% of people with addiction problems have an underlying mental disorder. And for prisoners, 85% of prisoners had a history with drugs and alcohol. And out of them, half had an underlying mental disorder. In 1978, I armed robbed drugstores and struck a pharmacist and firearm discharged in the store. But I ended up, ultimately, when I went to trial, I tried the insanity defense. And a psychologist did testify that I couldn't differentiate between right and wrong because of the issues I had going on with the drug addiction and other factors. And she testified that without help, I would do the same thing again. I needed treatment, a long-term treatment. And what she said was true. I did end up doing it again, during the sentence and stuff. I ended up getting involved, taking over a prison, escaping, stole a car, run through roadblocks, did a whole litany of things. And then when I finally got out of prison, what did I do? I stayed out over 3 years, but ultimately I did it again. I went back to the drinking and the drugging, and then ended up with a 35-year federal prison sentence. During the first 7 years, I was living the thug life inside of prison, doing all of running parlay tickets and a lot of things I can't really discuss. That dealt with, the mind-altering substances, and people had been there. Ultimately, I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. I could run circles around the police, but, it was that karma, I would get away with a lot of things, but then I have to end up paying, and it was just over and over and over, and finally I just got wore out. I knew there wasn't no parole, and at the time it was right before I turned 38 years old, and I knew chances were I was going to die in prison, and on one level I really didn't care, But, on the other side of the equation, I still had a family that loved and cared for me. And you can believe I thought about removing myself from life on more than one occasion. And one of the things that kept me from doing it was knowing how it affected my mom when I lost an older brother. I ultimately sought help through the psychology department. And then I had a psychologist. She was very patient with me. She knew I was still, using drugs and alcohol. And she told me, toward the last of the few times I saw her, that normally they wouldn't treat people if you were still using. But God had put her in my life for a reason. And ultimately, between her, when I first started, and then getting involved with a drug treatment specialist, then I ultimately decided to change my life. And that did take a lot of work once I made the commitment to change. And, the drug treatment specialist, she had me to write in journals and to write about the most shameful thing I ever did. And then that's what ultimately led to me doing what would be the equivalent of 12-step programs of doing a 4th step and a 5th step. That was April 1995, and only one time I had a slip. And I took 2 tokes off a joint, and then I actually threw it away midstream and said, "This ain't what I want," and I've been clean and sober ever since. And, that's evidence that miracles happen, because I continue to stay sober, even though at the time I didn't know if I was going to get out of prison. But it just didn't matter, because my drinking and using, it was just the fun had been gone for years, and I just couldn't get away from it. I was enslaved to that addiction, and I was in more of a prison because of my addiction than I was because of my incarceration. And the miracle happened where, toward the end of the sentence, I mean, when I say the end, I'd already done over 25 years. Then it started looking like I just might get out of prison. And in my sobriety, I've been focusing trying to become a better man. So, just I wanted to be a good person. I got sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I didn't like who I'd become. So last night I was in a 12-step meeting online, and I mentioned where we discussed the pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization, and I shared it's been so long now, I don't even really know what that feels like anymore, because I don't live my life that way. In 12-step programs, or 9th step, you make direct amends and stuff if you're wrong, and that's except when to do so would injure them or others. And I really didn't like doing that. So the way I live my life today, I don't have to worry about doing that, because I try to do everybody right. I try to treat people the way I want to be treated, and I have a good life today. Financially, yeah, I might not be in the best financial condition, but I'm in my own home. I bought my house 2 years ago, and it was only by the grace of God that I ended up with it. And that's another story I'll share at another date. But the point is, if people want to change, you really can. You just got to be willing to do the things that it takes to be able to do that. You've got to give up a lot of the old behaviors and start bringing in some of the new. But just as the 2002 study suggested, people that have an underlying mental disorder, you need to do something to treat the mental disorder, and at the same time do something that deals with the substance abuse problem, whether it's drugs or alcohol or whatever. So that's what I was actually doing, and I've been doing it long before they come out with that study. So my life is a testament to the facts of that. And I shared my story with the National Institute of Mental Health, and one of them in Louisiana, they wanted to use my story in some of their, for some of their meetings, to be able to try to get the funding and things like that they needed to be able to help other people that had those disorders. So, nothing happens in God's world by mistake. It all works the way it's supposed to. And today I'm grateful. I feel fortunate that I'm still alive and kicking. I don't feel bitter about spending my life in prison, because that was God's way of saving me from myself. And, and very few people will make it to this part of the video. And it'll be a miracle if you do. And if you do, please put a 1 in the comments. But yeah, I won't see too many ones. But that doesn't matter, because maybe some of the things I said will still help somebody decide to change their life and to move on and to find the life that they deserve to live. Thanks for watching.